My name is Christine. I'm 32 years old, and my entire world cracked open when my parents announced they were giving my sister $40 million, a beachfront mansion, and a private jet. But what they didn't know was that a neighbor would slip me a letter that would change everything. After 27 years of watching my sister Melissa receive every blessing while I got the scraps, my father decided to make it official. He gathered the family in our Connecticut estate's grand dining room and declared that Melissa would inherit the bulk of his fortune. The way he said it, with such pride and certainty, made my stomach twist into knots. Melissa just sat there, glowing with that perfect smile she'd mastered since childhood, acting like she deserved every penny. Dad thought I would accept it quietly like I always had, but this time he went too far. The consequences would be far beyond what any of us could imagine. Before I continue my story, let me tell you where I'm from and ask you to leave a like and subscribe for more family secrets that nobody talks about. Growing up in Westchester County, I learned early that I was the shadow child. While Melissa excelled in everything from piano recitals to academic competitions, I struggled to get even a fraction of the attention she commanded so effortlessly. Our parents, Richard and Patricia Morrison, built their pharmaceutical empire from nothing, and they expected their daughters to reflect that same excellence. The problem was, only one of us seemed capable of meeting those impossible standards. I remember being 8 years old, sitting at my tiny desk in the corner of our library, trying to finish my homework while Melissa practiced violin in the music room next door. The melody drifted through the walls, each note perfect and deliberate, while I struggled with basic multiplication tables. When I finally worked up the courage to ask Dad for help, he barely glanced up from his newspaper and said, "Ask your sister. She's always been the smart one." That became the pattern of our childhood. Melissa was the smart one, the talented one, the beautiful one. I was simply Christine, existing in her overwhelming shadow. During family dinners, they would discuss Melissa's latest achievements while I picked at my food in silence. When relatives visited, they always wanted to hear about Melissa's accomplishments. I might as well have been invisible. The inequality became more pronounced as we grew older. When Melissa turned 16, our parents threw her an elaborate Sweet 16 party at the country club, complete with a professional photographer and a 3-tier cake. When I turned 16 2 years later, we had dinner at home with store-bought dessert. When Melissa graduated valedictorian from her prestigious boarding school, Dad bought her a brand new BMW. When I graduated with decent grades from the local public school, I got a congratulatory card with $50 inside. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened 3 months ago. Dad called a family meeting, something he rarely did unless it involved business or major announcements. Melissa had flown in from her Manhattan apartment, looking stunning as always in her designer suit and perfectly styled blonde hair. At 28, she had already established herself as a successful investment banker, another feather in her cap that our parents never tired of mentioning to their friends. I sat across from her at the polished mahogany table, wearing my best dress, which suddenly felt shabby in comparison. Dad stood at the head of the table, his silver hair gleaming under the crystal chandelier, while Mom sat beside him with that proud smile she reserved exclusively for discussions about Melissa. "I've been thinking about the future," Dad began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he used in board meetings, "about legacy and ensuring our family's prosperity continues for generations to come." My heart started racing. I had always hoped that despite their obvious favoritism, they would treat us equally when it came to inheritance. After all, we were both their daughters. We both carried the Morrison name. "After careful consideration," Dad continued, "I've decided that Melissa will inherit the majority of our estate, including the beachfront property in the Hamptons, the company shares, and liquid assets totaling approximately $40 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. $40 million. I tried to process the number, but it seemed impossible. That was more money than most people could imagine, and it was going entirely to my sister. Additionally, Dad said, his chest swelling with pride, "We'll be purchasing a private jet for Melissa's use, considering her demanding travel schedule and the importance of her work." Melissa's eyes lit up, and she reached over to squeeze Dad's hand. "Thank you, Daddy. I promise I'll honor our family legacy." I sat there in stunned silence, waiting for him to mention what I would receive. Maybe it wouldn't be as much, but surely there was something set aside for me. The seconds ticked by, and still nothing. Finally, I found my voice. "What about me?" Dad looked at me as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Oh, Christine. Of course, you'll receive something. We're setting aside a trust fund of about $200,000 for you. That should be more than enough to get you started." 200,000. After 40 million, it sounded like pocket change. I felt the familiar burn of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of them. "I think that's very generous," Mom added, though her tone suggested she thought I should be grateful for even that much. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. They discussed legal details and timeline, but I barely heard any of it. All I could think about was how easily they had dismissed me, how little they thought I deserved. 27 years of being the forgettable daughter had led to this moment, where my worth was quantified at less than 1% of what they were giving my sister. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. The house felt different somehow, like it was already preparing to belong entirely to Melissa. I thought about all the times I had tried to prove myself, all the small victories they had overlooked, all the ways I had tried to earn their love and approval. The weeks following that devastating announcement felt like living in a nightmare. Every day brought new reminders of my diminished status in the family. Melissa had started making plans for renovating the Hamptons house, talking excitedly about installing a wine cellar and updating the guest quarters. She'd already scheduled appointments with interior designers and architects, treating the property like it was already hers. I continued going through the motions of my daily life, working at the local community center where I coordinated after-school programs for underprivileged kids. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly didn't pay much, but it gave me purpose. These children understood what it felt like to be overlooked, to be considered less important than others. In some ways, working with them was the only thing that kept me sane during those dark weeks. My parents had always been dismissive of my career choice. "Social work is admirable," Mom would say with that patronizing tone, "but it's not really building anything, is it?" They couldn't understand why I chose to work with struggling families when I could have pursued something more lucrative or prestigious. But seeing the smile on a 10-year-old's face when they finally grasped a difficult math concept, or helping a single mother navigate the system to get her kids the support they needed, that felt more meaningful than any stock portfolio or board position. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the one actually making a difference in people's lives, while Melissa spent her days moving money around for wealthy clients who already had more than they could spend. But our parents saw dollar signs and status, not impact or compassion. 2 weeks after the announcement, Melissa invited me to lunch at her favorite upscale restaurant in Manhattan. I should have known it wasn't a sisterly gesture of support. She wanted to gloat. "I hope you're not taking this inheritance thing too hard," she said, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. "I mean, Dad's decision makes perfect sense when you think about it logically." I set down my fork, my appetite vanishing. "Does it?" "Well, yes," she continued, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "I've always been more business-minded, more responsible with money. Dad needs to know his life's work will be in capable hands. You're more creative, artistic. Money isn't really your thing." The condescension in her voice made my blood boil. She was rewriting history, making my exclusion sound like a thoughtful decision based on our different personalities rather than blatant favoritism. "Besides," she added, taking a sip of her expensive wine, 200,000 is nothing to sneeze at. You could buy a nice little house somewhere, maybe start that nonprofit you used to talk about in college." A nice little house. Somewhere. While she would own a beachfront mansion worth millions. "I'm sure you'll figure out how to make it work," she said with that same bright smile that had charmed our parents for decades. "You've always been resourceful." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her exactly what I thought of her patronizing attitude and fake concern. But I had spent so many years swallowing my anger, accepting my role as the lesser daughter, that the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I excused myself and left the restaurant, walking aimlessly through the busy Manhattan streets until my rage subsided into the familiar ache of disappointment. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. I was at my parents' house, helping Mom plan a dinner party she was hosting for Dad's business associates. She had me arranging flowers and polishing silver, treating me like hired help while Melissa was upstairs on a conference call, making what Mom called important business decisions. "Make sure those roses are perfectly symmetrical," Mom instructed, hovering over my shoulder. "I don't want anything looking amateur tonight." As I adjusted the flowers for the third time, I overheard Dad on the phone in his study. The door was slightly open, and his voice carried into the dining room. "Yes, I'm confident in my decision," he was saying. "Melissa has always been the responsible one. Christine, well, she's never really applied herself, has she? She's content with her little charity work, playing house with other people's problems. She doesn't have the drive or intelligence to handle real responsibility." My hands stilled on the flower stems. He was talking about me like I was a failed experiment, a disappointing investment that had never paid off. "No, I don't feel guilty about it," Dad continued. "You have to make practical decisions in these situations. Emotion can't cloud good judgment. Melissa will carry on the family legacy properly. Christine will be fine with what she's getting. It's more than most people ever see." I carefully set down the flowers and walked out of the house without saying goodbye to anyone. I drove home to my small apartment, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. That night, I called in sick to work and spent the entire day in bed, unable to face the world. But something changed in me during those dark hours. The hurt began transforming into something else. Not quite anger, but a steely resolve I had never felt before. I was tired of being invisible, tired of accepting scraps, tired of pretending that their treatment of me was normal or fair. For the first time in my life, I started seriously considering what it would mean to fight back. Not just complain or feel sorry for myself, but actually challenge their decision. I had no idea how or what I could possibly do against their united front. But the idea took root and began to grow. The timing of what happened next still gives me chills. It was as if the universe had been waiting for me to reach that breaking point, waiting for me to be ready for what was coming. 3 days after overhearing Dad's brutal assessment of my worth, I was coming home from another difficult day at work when I noticed old Mr. Henderson from next door standing by my mailbox. He was in his 70s, a quiet man who had lived next to my parents' estate for as long as I could remember. We had exchanged pleasantries over the years, but never had any substantial conversations. "Christine?" he called out as I parked my car. There was something unusual in his voice, a weight that made me pause. "Mr. Henderson, how are you?" I asked, walking over to where he stood. He glanced around nervously, as if checking to make sure we weren't being watched. "I need to speak with you. It's important." There was an urgency in his tone that surprised me. Mr. Henderson had always seemed like the type of man who chose his words carefully, who didn't get involved in other people's business. "Of course," I said. "Would you like to come in?" He shook his head quickly. "Not here, too close. Can you meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street tomorrow morning? Early, around 7. The request was so unusual that I almost asked him what this was about, but something in his expression stopped me. He looked worried, almost frightened. "I'll be there," I promised. That night, I could barely sleep. What could Mr. Henderson possibly want to discuss that required such secrecy? I ran through every interaction I could remember having with him, but nothing seemed significant enough to warrant this kind of clandestine meeting. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table where we could speak privately. Mr. Henderson walked in exactly at 7, looking around the small cafe before spotting me. He had a manila envelope tucked under his arm. "Thank you for coming," he said, settling into the chair across from me. His hands were shaking slightly as he placed the envelope on the table between us. "Mr. Henderson, what's this about?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the envelope like it contained something dangerous. Finally, he looked up at me with sad, tired eyes. Christine, I've watched you grow up. I've seen how your family treats you, and I've wanted to speak up for years, but it wasn't my place. But what's happening now? I can't stay silent anymore. My heart started beating faster. I don't understand. Your grandfather, he said quietly. Harold Morrison. Did you know him well? Not really, I admitted. He died when I was 12. I remember him as being kind, but we didn't spend much time together. Dad always said he was too busy with business to visit often. Mr. Henderson nodded grimly. That's not the whole truth. Harold and I were friends for over 30 years. Good friends. We served in Korea together, started our businesses around the same time, raised our families as neighbors. I probably knew him better than anyone. He paused to take a sip of his coffee, his hands still trembling slightly. The year before he died, Harold came to me with concerns about your father. He was worried about Richard's character, about some of the business decisions he was making. Harold was a man of principle, Christine. He built his company on honest dealing and fair treatment of employees. But Richard was different. More ruthless. More willing to cut corners. I felt a chill run down my spine. What does this have to do with me? Everything, Mr. Henderson said, pushing the envelope toward me. Harold was very specific about his wishes regarding his estate. He left detailed instructions about how his wealth should be distributed, and those instructions were very different from what your father has told your family. My hands were shaking now as I stared at the envelope. What do you mean? Harold loved both of his granddaughters, but he was particularly fond of you, Christine. He saw something in you that reminded him of himself, a genuine kindness, a concern for others, a sense of justice. He used to tell me stories about your visits, how you would spend hours listening to his old war stories and asking thoughtful questions about his business philosophy. I remembered those conversations. While Melissa would grow bored and wander off to watch television or play video games, I had always found Grandpa Harold fascinating. He had built his pharmaceutical company not just to make money, but to develop medicines that would help people who couldn't afford expensive treatments. He had stories about traveling to rural communities to distribute medications for free, about setting up clinics in underserved areas. He made a will, Mr. Henderson continued, a very detailed will that specifically outlined his wishes for the inheritance. I was one of the witnesses, along with his lawyer, James Mitchell. But after Harold died, Richard claimed there had been some kind of legal complication, that the will needed to be modified. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. I was suspicious then, but I didn't have proof. But over the years, I've pieced things together. I've stayed in touch with James Mitchell, and recently, he's been having his own concerns about what happened after Harold's death. I felt like the floor was shifting beneath me. Are you saying my father lied about Grandpa's will? I'm saying that the will Harold wrote specifically named you as the primary beneficiary of his estate. Not Melissa, you, Christine. He left you the majority of his wealth because he believed you would use it to continue his legacy of helping people. The coffee shop seemed to fade away around me. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as the implications of what he was saying sank in. But that's not possible, I whispered. Dad would never. He couldn't just change a will. Mr. Henderson's expression was grim. With enough money and the right lawyers, a lot of things are possible. Especially when the primary beneficiary is a 12-year-old girl who doesn't understand legal documents and trusts her father to handle everything properly. He gestured to the envelope again. James Mitchell kept copies of the original documents. He's been carrying this burden for 20 years, but he's getting old now, and his conscience is bothering him. He asked me to give these to you. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and pulled out several pages of legal documents. The top page was clearly labeled as Last Will and Testament of Harold Morrison, dated just 3 months before his death. I scanned the dense legal language until I found the section about distribution of assets. And there, in black and white, was my name. Not as a minor beneficiary, but as the primary heir to an estate that was worth, even 20 years ago, over $60 million. The document outlined Harold's reasoning in clear terms. To my granddaughter, Christine Morrison, who has shown exceptional character and compassion, and who I believe will honor the principles upon which I built my life and business, I leave the majority of my estate, including all business holdings and properties, with the expectation that she will use these resources to continue helping those in need. Melissa was mentioned too, but only as a secondary beneficiary, receiving a substantial but much smaller inheritance. I read the paragraph 3 times before the words fully registered. According to this will, I should have inherited everything that was now being given to my sister, plus 20 years of growth and investment returns. "This is real?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Mr. Henderson nodded solemnly. "James Mitchell is willing to testify to its authenticity. He's kept detailed records of everything that happened after your grandfather's death, including some very suspicious communications from your father's lawyers." I stared at the documents, feeling like my entire world was reshaping itself around me. Everything I had believed about my place in the family, about my worth, about my future, all of it had been built on a lie. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, the legal documents spread across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture I wasn't sure I was ready to see. Every time I read Grandpa Harold's words, I felt a mixture of vindication and rage that made it hard to breathe. He had seen something in me. He had believed in me enough to entrust me with his life's work, and my own father had stolen that from me. I called in sick to work again, knowing I couldn't face anyone until I figured out what to do with this information. The weight of the secret felt crushing. For 20 years, I had lived as the forgotten daughter, accepting my parents' assessment of my worth, when the truth was that my own grandfather had chosen me as his successor. By evening, I had made a decision. I called James Mitchell's office. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Christine Morrison. I believe you were expecting my call." There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his voice was heavy with emotion. "Christine, yes, I've been hoping you would contact me. How much did Robert tell you?" "Robert?" I was confused for a moment before realizing he meant Mr. Henderson. "He gave me copies of my grandfather's will. The real will. I'm so sorry," Mr. Mitchell said quietly. "I should have contacted you years ago, but your father..." He made it very clear that any interference from me would result in serious legal consequences. I was younger then, and I was scared, but I've regretted my silence every day since. We arranged to meet the following afternoon at his office. I barely slept that night, alternating between fury at my father's betrayal and excitement at the possibility of finally claiming what was rightfully mine. Mr. Mitchell's law office was in an older building downtown, filled with dark wood furniture and law books that looked like they hadn't been moved in decades. The man himself was in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed burdened by years of carrying this secret. "Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever knew," he began, gesturing for me to sit across from his desk. "When he came to me to draft his will, he spent hours explaining his reasoning. He was very concerned about leaving his legacy in the right hands." "What exactly did my father do?" I asked, needing to understand the full scope of his deception. Mr. Mitchell opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. "After Harold died, your father came to me claiming that there were problems with the will. He said Harold had expressed concerns about leaving such a large inheritance to a minor, that he wanted to wait until you were older to make a final decision. But that's not what the will says." "No, it's not. But your father had hired a team of very expensive lawyers, and they presented what they claimed was a more recent will, dated just weeks before Harold's death. This new will named your father as the primary executor with broad discretionary powers over the distribution of assets." I felt sick. "And you believed it?" Mr. Mitchell's face flushed with shame. I had my doubts, but the document appeared legitimate. It had been notarized, witnessed, and filed properly. Your father's lawyers threatened to sue me for malpractice if I challenged it, claiming that my relationship with Harold had compromised my professional judgment. "So you just let it happen?" "I was a fool," he said simply. "I was intimidated by their legal team, and I convinced myself that maybe Harold had changed his mind at the last minute. But over the years, as I watched what happened to you, I began to realize the truth. He pulled out another document. This is a letter Harold wrote to me, sealed and dated 2 days before his death. He asked me to open it only if there were ever questions about his intentions regarding his will. With shaking hands, I took the letter and unfolded it. Grandpa Harold's handwriting was still clear and strong, despite his illness. "Jim," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means someone has challenged my will or tried to alter my wishes. I want to be absolutely clear. Christine is to inherit the bulk of my estate, exactly as outlined in my will dated March 15th. She has shown me more genuine kindness and moral character at 12 years old than many adults display in a lifetime. I trust her to use my wealth wisely and compassionately. I am particularly concerned about Richard's reaction to this decision. My son has always been driven by ambition rather than principle, and I fear he will not accept my choice to bypass him in favor of Christine. If he challenges this will, please know that it represents my true wishes, made with a sound mind and full understanding of the consequences. Christine reminds me of myself at her age, curious, caring, and genuinely concerned about making the world better. That is the legacy I want to leave behind. Harold Morrison." I read the letter twice, tears blurring my vision. This was proof, undeniable proof, that my father had not only stolen my inheritance, but had betrayed his own father's final wishes. "Why didn't you open this sooner?" I asked. "Your father never officially challenged the will," Mr. Mitchell explained. "He simply claimed it needed to be modified for practical reasons. Technically, he didn't contest Harold's wishes. He just reinterpreted them. With a forged document. That's what I believe, yes, but proving it after 20 years would be difficult. However, with this letter and the documentation I've maintained, we might have enough evidence to reopen the case." The possibility hung between us like a lifeline. After 20 years of being treated as the lesser daughter, I could finally prove that my grandfather had chosen me, that I had been worthy all along. "What would happen if we challenged it now?" I asked. "It would be complicated," Mr. Mitchell admitted. "The statute of limitations for will contests has passed, but there might be exceptions in cases involving fraud or forgery. We'd need to prove that your father deliberately deceived the court and that you were unaware of the deception until now." "But it's possible?" "It's possible. But Christine, you need to understand what you'd be taking on. Your father has had 20 years to build his legal and financial defenses. He has resources and connections that most people can't match. Fighting him would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating. I thought about that dinner conversation where Dad had dismissed me so casually, about Melissa's condescending lunch where she'd treated me like a charity case, about all the years of being invisible while my sister basked in undeserved praise. "I want to fight," I said firmly. "I want to expose what he did." Mr. Mitchell nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to be very careful about how we proceed. Your father can't know what we're planning until we're ready to file the paperwork. Once we challenge the will, there's no going back." As I left his office that afternoon, I felt different. For the first time in my adult life, I had power. I had the truth. And I was going to use both to reclaim what had been stolen from me. But first, I needed to prepare for the storm that was coming. Because once my family learned what I knew, everything would change forever. The next 2 weeks were the most intense period of my life. Working with Mr. Mitchell and a private investigator he recommended, we began building a case that would expose 20 years of deception. Every day brought new evidence of my father's elaborate scheme to hide the truth. The investigator, Sarah Chen, was a former FBI agent who specialized in financial fraud cases. She approached the investigation with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years unraveling complex criminal enterprises. "Your father was very thorough," she told me during one of our meetings. "But no cover-up is perfect. There are always traces left behind." She had discovered discrepancies in the dates of the forged will, inconsistencies in the witness signatures, and most damning of all, financial records showing that my father had paid substantial sums to certain individuals shortly after the estate was settled. "Look at this," Sarah said, showing me bank records on her laptop. 3 days after the probate court accepted the modified will, your father made payments totaling nearly $500,000 to 4 different people. One was a notary public who had previously lost his license for falsifying documents. Another was a paralegal from the law firm that represented the estate. The evidence was overwhelming, but as Mr. Mitchell had warned, pursuing it would be like going to war with my own family. I found myself lying awake at night, imagining the confrontation that was coming. How would I look my father in the eye and accuse him of stealing from me? How would my mother react when she learned that everything they had built was based on fraud? And what about Melissa? Did she know the truth? Or was she as much a victim of Dad's deception as I was? That question was answered sooner than I expected. I was at the grocery store when I ran into my sister coming out of the wine section, her arms full of expensive bottles. "Christine," she called out cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I'm planning the housewarming party for the Hamptons place. You should come. It'll be fun to celebrate as a family." The casualness of her invitation, the assumption that I would want to celebrate her acquisition of what should have been mine, made my blood boil. But I forced myself to smile. "That sounds lovely," I said. "When are you planning it?" "Next weekend. I've already hired caterers and a band. Dad's flying in some of his business partners. He wants to show off the renovations I've been doing." She continued chatting about her plans, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me. As she described the new furniture she was buying and the improvements she was making to my grandfather's beloved beach house, I realized that confronting her individually might be the kindest approach. "Melissa," I said carefully, "can I ask you something? Do you remember much about Grandpa Harold?" Her expression shifted slightly. "Not really. I mean, I was only 16 when he died." "Why?" "I was just thinking about him lately. About his will and everything." Something flickered in her eyes, too quickly for me to interpret, but definitely there. "Well, you know how those things go," she said, her tone becoming more guarded. "Legal stuff is always complicated. Dad handled all of that. Did you ever wonder why Grandpa left everything to Dad instead of dividing it between his grandchildren?" Melissa set down her wine bottles and looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation. "Christine, what's this really about?" I had intended to ease into the topic, but something in her tone made me change my mind. "I found out about the real will, Melissa, the one Grandpa actually wrote." The color drained from her face so quickly that I thought she might faint. She glanced around the grocery store, then grabbed my arm. "Not here," she said urgently. "We need to talk somewhere private." 20 minutes later, we were sitting in her car in an empty parking lot, the expensive wine forgotten in the grocery store. Melissa's perfect composure had cracked, and for the first time in years, she looked genuinely vulnerable. "How much do you know?" she asked quietly. "Everything. I know that Grandpa left his estate to me, not you. I know that Dad forged documents to steal my inheritance, and I know that you've known the truth this whole time." Melissa closed her eyes and leaned back against the headrest. When she opened them again, there were tears. "I was 19 when Dad told me," she said. "I had just started college, and he called me into his study for what he said was an important family discussion. He explained that there had been a problem with Grandpa's will, that it contained provisions that would have been devastating for our family's financial stability." "What kind of provisions?" "According to Dad, Grandpa had left most of the money to you, but with conditions that would have required us to liquidate the business and donate huge portions to charity. He said Grandpa had lost his grip on reality in his final months, that he was being influenced by people who wanted to destroy everything our family had built." I stared at her in disbelief. "And you believed that?" "I was 19, Christine. I trusted our father. He said he was protecting the family, protecting you from having to deal with impossible responsibilities while you were still a child. He promised that when you got older, when you had proven yourself capable, you would receive your fair share. But I never did." Melissa's face crumpled. "I know. I started questioning it years ago, especially as I watched you struggle financially while I had everything handed to me. But by then, it felt too late to change anything. Dad had invested the money, built the business, created jobs for hundreds of people. If the truth came out, it would destroy everything. So you decided to keep lying. I decided to keep quiet, she corrected. There's a difference. I never actively participated in the deception, but I didn't stop it either. And that makes me just as guilty. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 20 years of deception hanging between us. Finally, Melissa turned to look at me directly. What are you going to do now? I'm going to challenge the will. I'm going to expose what Dad did and reclaim what's rightfully mine. She nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this answer. It's going to destroy our family. Dad destroyed our family 20 years ago, I replied. I'm just going to reveal the truth. Melissa was quiet for a long time, staring out the windshield at the empty parking lot. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. If you do this, I'll lose everything. You'll lose things that were never yours to begin with. I know, she whispered. And you have every right to take them back. But Christine, please understand, I built my life around this lie. My career, my relationships, my sense of identity. Everything I am is tied to resources that apparently belong to you. For the first time since learning the truth, I felt a pang of sympathy for my sister. She was as much a victim of our father's greed as I was, just in a different way. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Melissa. I'm doing it because I can't live with the lie anymore. She wiped her eyes and straightened up, some of her usual composure returning. When are you planning to confront Dad? Soon. My lawyer says we have enough evidence to file a formal challenge to the will. He's not going to give up without a fight. You know that, right? Dad has spent 20 years building defenses around this secret. He'll use every resource he has to protect himself. I thought about the scared, dismissed little girl I had been, always apologizing for existing, always accepting that I deserved less than everyone else. Then he's going to discover that I'm stronger than he thinks I am. The confrontation with my father came sooner than I had planned. 3 days after my conversation with Melissa, I received a furious phone call from Dad demanding that I come to the house immediately. We need to discuss some very serious allegations that have been brought to my attention, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I knew immediately that he had found out about my investigation. Someone had tipped him off, possibly Melissa, or maybe one of his many connections in the legal community had heard whispers about what we were preparing. As I drove to my childhood home, I felt surprisingly calm. For weeks I had been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, I felt ready. I had the truth on my side, and I was done being intimidated by my father's authority. I found him pacing in his study, his usual composed demeanor replaced by agitation. Mom was there too, sitting stiffly in one of the leather chairs, her face pale, but her expression unreadable. Sit down, Dad commanded, pointing to the chair across from his desk. I remained standing. I think I'll stay here. His eyes flashed with annoyance. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by me. I understand you've been talking to James Mitchell, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, and that you've somehow gotten your hands on documents that you think give you some kind of claim to your grandfather's estate. Not some kind of claim, Dad. The rightful claim. The one you stole from me 20 years ago. Mom gasped softly, but Dad's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked relieved that the secret was finally out in the open. Your grandfather was a sick old man in his final months, Dad said coldly. He wasn't thinking clearly. The will you think you found was the product of a confused mind, influenced by people who didn't understand the complexities of running a business empire. That's not what his letter says. The one he wrote to Mr. Mitchell specifically addressing concerns about people challenging his will. For the first time, Dad looked genuinely surprised. What letter? I pulled out a copy of Grandpa Harold's letter and handed it to him. I watched his face as he read it, saw the moment when he realized that his carefully constructed story was falling apart. This doesn't prove anything, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. It proves that Grandpa was mentally competent when he wrote his will. It proves that he specifically wanted me to inherit his estate. And it proves that you knew you were going against his wishes. Dad crumpled the letter and threw it aside. You have no idea what you're talking about. Do you think inheriting that money would have been some kind of blessing? You were 12 years old, Christine. 12. You would have been destroyed by that kind of responsibility. So you decided to protect me by stealing from me? I decided to protect our family, he shouted, his composure finally cracking. Your grandfather was going to destroy everything we had built. He wanted to turn our pharmaceutical company into some kind of charity operation, giving away medications for free, establishing clinics in countries that couldn't pay for services. It would have bankrupted us within 5 years. Maybe that's what should have happened. Easy to say when you've never had to make payroll for 300 employees, never had to balance shareholder expectations with idealistic dreams. Your grandfather built something great, but he lost sight of reality in his final years. Mom finally spoke up, her voice shaky. Christine, honey, your father did what he thought was best for everyone. The money stayed in the family. It's not like it went to strangers. It didn't stay in the family equally, though, did it? You gave it all to Melissa while I struggled to pay rent on a social worker's salary. Because Melissa showed the aptitude for handling wealth responsibly, Dad snapped. She understood business, understood investments. You chose to work with poor people and lost causes. How could we trust you with millions of dollars when you can't even manage your own finances properly? The circular logic of his argument was infuriating. He had stolen my inheritance, then used my resulting financial struggles as justification for why I didn't deserve it in the first place. I work with poor people because I care about helping others, I said, just like Grandpa did. That's exactly why he chose me to carry on his legacy. Your grandfather was a sentimental fool who let emotion cloud his business judgment. And you're a thief who betrayed his own father's dying wishes. The word hung in the air between us like a slap. Dad's face turned red with fury, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike me. How dare you? He said quietly. After everything I've provided for you, after the home I gave you, the education I paid for, the opportunities I created, this is how you repay me? By threatening to destroy our family with lies and accusations? I'm not threatening anything. I'm stating facts. You forged documents, bribed witnesses, and stole my inheritance. Those aren't accusations. They're crimes. Mom started crying softly, but I couldn't let myself be swayed by her tears. She had been complicit in this deception for 20 years. What do you want? Dad asked finally. I want what's mine. All of it. The money, the properties, the business holdings. Everything that should have been mine for the past 20 years, plus interest. Dad laughed, but there was no humor in it. You have no idea what you're asking for. The business alone is worth over $200 million now. Add the properties, the investments, the accumulated interest. You're talking about $250 million. The number was staggering, but I tried not to let my shock show. Then I guess Grandpa made a very wise investment. Even if you somehow managed to prove your ridiculous claims in court, which you won't, do you understand what would happen? The legal fees alone would consume millions. The publicity would destroy our family's reputation. Melissa would lose everything she's worked for. Your mother and I would be financially ruined. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to steal from your own daughter. Dad walked around his desk until he was standing directly in front of me, using his height to try to intimidate me. I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from this madness. I'll increase your trust fund to $5 million, more money than you could spend in a lifetime. You can quit that ridiculous job, buy a nice house, live comfortably forever. But if you continue with this legal fantasy, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you. The same way you destroyed Grandpa's legacy? Your grandfather is dead, Christine. He's been dead for 20 years. The living matter more than the dead. I looked at this man who had raised me, who had dismissed me my entire life, who had stolen my inheritance and then convinced himself he was protecting me. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to earn his approval, all the times I had accepted his assessment of my worth. You're right about one thing, I said quietly. Grandpa is dead, but his wishes aren't, and I'm going to honor them, whether you like it or not. I turned to leave, but Dad grabbed my arm. If you do this, you're no longer my daughter. I'll disown you completely. You'll never be welcome in this house again." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. "You disowned me 20 years ago when you stole my inheritance. You just never told me." I pulled free from his grip and walked out of the house, knowing I would never return as his daughter. But for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. The legal battle that followed was every bit as brutal as Dad had promised it would be. Within a week of our confrontation, his lawyers had filed motions to have my case dismissed, claiming it was a frivolous lawsuit motivated by greed and family jealousy. They painted me as an unstable woman who couldn't accept her place in the family hierarchy and was now trying to destroy her relatives out of spite. But Mr. Mitchell had prepared me for this strategy. "Your father's legal team will try to make this about your character rather than the facts," he warned. "They'll dig into every aspect of your life, looking for anything they can use to discredit you." He was right. Within days, private investigators were following me, interviewing my co-workers, examining my financial records. They questioned my fitness as a potential inheritor, pointing to my modest lifestyle and career in social work as evidence that I couldn't handle substantial wealth. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were using my financial struggles, which resulted from their theft, as proof that I didn't deserve what they had stolen. But we had our own ammunition. Sarah Chen had uncovered even more evidence of the forgery, including testimony from the original notary who admitted he had been paid to backdate documents. The paralegal who had helped create the false will was now in his 70s and suffering from dementia. But his medical records showed he had been treated for severe anxiety and depression in the months following Grandpa Harold's death, symptoms consistent with someone struggling with guilt over criminal activity. The case began attracting media attention, which was both helpful and painful. Local news outlets picked up the story of the stolen inheritance, and soon national media was covering what they called a real-life family drama involving corporate fraud and sibling rivalry. The attention brought unexpected allies. Other families came forward with similar stories of suspected will fraud, and several legal experts offered to assist with my case pro bono. More importantly, former employees of Grandpa Harold's company reached out to share stories that supported his reputation for integrity and mental competence right up until his death. "Harold Morrison was sharp as a tack," testified his former secretary, a woman in her 80s who had worked for him for 30 years. "Even when he was sick, his mind was completely clear. He knew exactly what he wanted to do with his money, and he talked about Christine all the time. He said she was the only one in the family who understood what the business was really supposed to be about." But the most devastating blow to Dad's defense came from an unexpected source. His own brother, my Uncle Tom, who had been estranged from the family for years due to a business dispute. "Richard called me 2 weeks after Dad's funeral," Uncle Tom testified during his deposition. "He was panicking about something related to the will. He said Dad had made a terrible mistake that could destroy the family business, and he needed my help to fix it. When I asked what kind of mistake, he said Dad had left too much control to someone who didn't understand business realities. He never mentioned Christine by name, but he was clearly talking about her." "What did you tell him?" Mr. Mitchell asked. "I told him that Dad's will was Dad's business, and if he didn't like it, he should have talked to him while he was alive. But Richard kept pushing, saying he had found a way to resolve the problem but needed family support. When I refused to get involved, he basically cut me out of the family entirely." The deposition was damning evidence that Dad had been planning to alter the will even before he claimed to have discovered problems with it. As the legal proceedings dragged on, the personal cost became enormous. My relationship with my mother deteriorated completely when she chose to support Dad's version of events, claiming that I was being manipulated by lawyers who were only interested in their fees. Melissa tried to stay neutral, but the stress was clearly taking a toll on her as well. "I keep thinking about all the money I spent over the years," she told me during one of our few conversations. "The vacations, the clothes, the apartment in Manhattan. If this money was supposed to be yours, then I've been living off what was essentially stolen goods." "I don't blame you for that," I assured her. "You didn't know the truth, but I suspected it. Deep down, I think I always knew something wasn't right about Dad's explanation. I just didn't want to face it because it would have meant giving up everything I had. The most difficult part wasn't the legal complexity or the media scrutiny. It was the complete destruction of my family relationships. Dad refused to speak to me at all, while Mom alternated between angry phone calls accusing me of destroying the family and tearful messages begging me to drop the lawsuit. But I also discovered support in unexpected places. My coworkers at the community center rallied around me, and many of the families I had helped over the years offered emotional support and encouragement. They understood what it meant to fight against powerful people who thought they could control your life. "You're doing the right thing," said Maria Santos, a single mother whose children I had helped get into after-school programs. "Rich people think they can take whatever they want from people like us, but you're showing them that's not always true." 6 months into the legal battle, Dad's lawyers made their first settlement offer, $10 million and a guarantee that I would never publicly discuss the case. "It's a significant amount," Mr. Mitchell told me as we reviewed the offer, "but it's nowhere near what you're entitled to, and accepting it would mean validating their version of events." I didn't hesitate. No deal. The rejection seemed to surprise Dad's legal team, who apparently expected that a large sum of money would be enough to make me go away. They clearly didn't understand that this had never been about money alone. It was about justice, truth, and honoring my grandfather's wishes. As we prepared for trial, I found myself thinking often about Grandpa Harold and the conversations we had when I was young. He used to tell me stories about standing up to bigger, more powerful competitors who tried to cheat or intimidate him. "The secret," he would say, "is to remember that being right gives you a strength that money can't buy. When you're fighting for truth and justice, you're never really fighting alone." I was about to find out if he was correct. The trial began on a cold February morning, nearly a year after Mr. Henderson had first handed me that manila envelope. The courthouse was packed with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers who had been following the case through the media coverage. Dad sat at the defendant's table with his team of expensive lawyers, looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and confident demeanor. He had apparently convinced himself that his superior resources and legal team would easily defeat what he saw as my desperate attempt to rewrite history. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Mr. Mitchell methodically presented document after document, proving that the will Dad had submitted to probate court was a forgery. Expert witnesses testified about inconsistencies in the paper, ink, and signatures. The former notary broke down in tears as he admitted his role in the fraud. The most powerful moment came when Mr. Mitchell read Grandpa Harold's letter aloud in court. The courtroom was completely silent as my grandfather's words echoed through the room, his voice speaking from beyond the grave to defend the granddaughter he had chosen as his heir. Dad's lawyers tried to discredit the letter, claiming it was irrelevant or potentially forged itself, but their objections sounded desperate. The handwriting analysis was conclusive, and the timeline matched perfectly with other documented evidence of Grandpa Harold's final days. When it came time for Dad to testify in his own defense, his composure finally cracked under cross-examination. "You claim you were protecting your daughter by hiding her grandfather's will," Mr. Mitchell said. "But isn't it true that you were actually protecting yourself from losing control of the family business?" "That's not—" "The situation was complicated," Dad stammered. "Was it complicated or was it simple greed? You saw an opportunity to steal millions of dollars from your 12-year-old daughter, and you took it." "I never stole anything. I was the one who built that business into what it is today. I was the one who made the smart investments and managed the risks. Christine would have destroyed everything with her naive idealism. So you decided that your father's final wishes didn't matter? That you knew better than the man who built the family fortune in the first place?" Dad's face turned red with fury. My father was dying and sentimental. He wasn't thinking about practical realities. Like the practical reality that theft is a crime? "Objection!" Dad's lawyer shouted. But the damage was done. Dad had essentially admitted that he had deliberately ignored his father's will because he disagreed with it. The most emotional moment of the trial came when I took the stand to testify about the impact of Dad's deception on my life. I talked about the years of feeling worthless and forgotten, about the financial struggles I had endured while my sister lived in luxury, about the dreams I had given up because I believed I wasn't worthy of anything better. But perhaps most importantly, I said, looking directly at the jury, my grandfather wanted his money to be used to help people who couldn't help themselves. For 20 years, that money has been sitting in investment accounts and luxury properties instead of funding medical clinics and charitable programs. Thousands of people who could have been helped have suffered because my father prioritized his own comfort over his father's legacy. When the defense tried to portray me as someone unfit to handle large sums of money, I was ready with detailed plans I had developed with the help of nonprofit experts. I outlined exactly how I intended to honor Grandpa Harold's vision: establishing free medical clinics in underserved communities, funding research into affordable medications, and creating scholarship programs for students from low-income families who wanted to pursue careers in healthcare. This isn't about revenge, I told the jury. It's about finally fulfilling the promises my grandfather made to the people he wanted to help. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. As the foreman stood to read their decision, the courtroom fell silent. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Christine Morrison. We find that the defendant, Richard Morrison, knowingly presented fraudulent documents to the probate court and unlawfully diverted assets that rightfully belonged to the plaintiff. The jury awarded me not just the original inheritance, but 20 years of accumulated interest and investment returns, plus punitive damages for the fraud. The total came to just over $300 million. I felt numb as the judge read the final judgment. After so many years of being told I was worth nothing, it was surreal to suddenly be worth more than I could have ever imagined. Dad's reaction was swift and predictable. Within hours of the verdict, his lawyers had filed appeals and motions, promising to fight the decision at every level. But legal experts said his chances of overturning such a clear-cut case were minimal. More importantly, the criminal implications of his fraud were now being investigated by the district attorney's office. The possibility of facing prison time seemed to finally penetrate his arrogance. 3 days after the verdict, Melissa came to see me at my apartment. She looked exhausted and older than her 28 years. I wanted to apologize, she said quietly, for all of it. For knowing the truth and staying silent, for benefiting from what was stolen from you, for not being the sister you deserved. I invited her in, and we sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had first read Grandpa Harold's will. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I'm going to do what Grandpa wanted me to do. I'm going to use this money to help people. And us? Our family?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I don't know if we can be a family after this. Too much has happened. Too many lies have been told. But maybe we can start over as individuals who choose to care about each other instead of being forced together by blood. Melissa nodded, tears in her eyes. I'd like that. And Christine? For what it's worth, I think Grandpa Harold was right about you. You're the strongest person I know. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Harold Morrison Community Health Center, the first of 12 medical clinics I was funding in underserved areas across the country. The bronze plaque by the entrance bore my grandfather's photograph and his favorite quote, "True wealth is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you give away." Dad had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and tax evasion, though he was appealing the conviction. Mom had filed for divorce and moved to Florida, claiming she couldn't bear the shame of what had happened. We exchanged Christmas cards, but we had little else to say to each other. Melissa had used her portion of what remained of the family assets to start a nonprofit organization focused on financial literacy education for young women. She said it was her way of trying to make amends for the years she had benefited from stolen money. As for me, I had quit my job at the community center to focus full-time on managing the foundation I had established in Grandpa Harold's name. It was the hardest work I had ever done, but also the most fulfilling. Every day brought new opportunities to honor the legacy that had been stolen from me for so long. Standing in that clinic lobby, watching doctors treat patients who couldn't afford care anywhere else, I finally understood what Grandpa Harold had seen in me all those years ago. He hadn't chosen me because I was perfect or brilliant or accomplished. He had chosen me because I understood that true success meant lifting others up, not climbing over them. The 12-year-old girl, who had been deemed unworthy of her grandfather's love, had grown into a woman who would spend the rest of her life proving him right. And that, I realized, was the greatest inheritance of all.